Listen to me. You are not in your villain era. You're not. But that's a good thing. Let's think about this for a minute, okay? Let's pause and let's think about what we're saying here. Villain. Some famous villains according to Google: Michael Myers, Anton Chigurh, the Joker, Freddy, Hannibal Lecter, Jack Torrance. Look, I'm not going to pretend I'm misunderstanding why the villain era has come about, but I would like to make a case for a much better fitting movie character trope for what the villain era is actually trying to accomplish. The villain era sounds good, right? It's trendy, it's intimidating, sounds kind of sexy, but I think it's really quite vulnerable at the heart of its requests. So if you've ever been tempted to enter your villain era, if you clicked this video because you want to know more about how we can step into our villain era, stay put. I have a better solution for you to try, and I'm going to tell you why it's actually kind of weird to say that you want to be in your villain era. First, what is a villain? The villain represents everything bad. It reflects our greatest fears as a society. You could basically call it the shadow of our collective consciousness. It represents everything that is shameful, cruel, outcast-worthy behavior, and a villain gets off on being those things. They are unapologetically evil and self-serving. The definition of a villain, according to Google, is, well, it's an evil character that's meant to further the plot, first of all, not main character energy, but also they are deliberately scoundrels or criminals. Deliberately. This distinction matters, I swear. But the thing is, I don't think that the people on TikTok saying that they're entering their villain era or encouraging others to do so are actually suggesting that we become truly abhorrent people. I don't. I get what it's about, but there's another trope that does all of that and then some that is not centered around malicious, awful characters. At the heart of the villain era, I think it's an attempt to reclaim and assert one's boundaries in the face of impossible purity standards. It allows you to be willingly disliked, which is much easier than being disliked after a lifetime of self-sacrificing and people-pleasing and failing at moral perfectionism. It is the boundary to end all boundaries, because a true villain does not give a shit about the fallout of their actions. And I bet you do. And if you do, that's good. You should. That means you're not a psychopath. Like Anton Chigurh, the most accurate psychopath ever portrayed on film, according to science. I digress. And I get it. There's such a demand to be good now. Not just good, but perfect. Scrutiny is at an all-time high. Forgiveness for mistakes is at an all-time low. We live in a world where these brave digital avatars harass other people about their lack of socially acceptable performative compassion while genuinely forgetting to be compassionate themselves. They assume the capacity and life experience of others so that they can position themselves as morally superior when they find a perceived wrongdoing of someone else. Or if their intentions aren't so good, they might see that they can actually profit off of this current social code and create wrongdoings to villainize someone else. It's no wonder that someone caught in the crosshairs of this would eventually just forfeit the charade and go, okay, fine, I'm a villain. What now? It allows people to take their power back by simply being human, perfectly human, which means very not perfect. Literally all of us, for the record. I think some people forget that sometimes. Some more than others, sure. But my God, I think anyone that's online today that has a social media account can find themselves susceptible to the exhaustion of always trying to be good enough. So naturally, a pushback is going to form, and that pushback has been the villain era. The pendulum always swings as far in the opposite direction as it's initially pulled back, so it is no wonder at all that we are going from Mr. Rogers to Michael Myers. These people have tried being people pleasers and it didn't work. So f*** it. I get it. Honestly, these self-proclaimed villains have a point. We really shouldn't have to ask permission to be the perfectly flawed reality of what we are. Being a perfect person, never upsetting anyone, never making a mistake is impossible. An impossible ask held up by probably well-meaning but unconsciously ironic charlatans. I understand the people-pleasing thing. I get the good girl complex. I also understand the desire to rebel and to fully free yourself from the expectation of having to be seen as good in anyone's eyes. It may mean you're the villain in someone else's story, but at least you get to be you. But, in the last couple of years, I've come to strongly resonate with a third option. You don't need to embrace your villain era to give yourself freedom from a moral purity circus. Besides, in film, villains always have a weakness. Really not a good example. Their worldview is just as rigid and unattainable as the goodness metrics of today, and any extreme leaves you open for exploitation. We're missing the mark of what it means to truly be human. To be human is to be nuanced, complex, always existing in a shade of gray, whether you want to admit it or not. Everyone exists on that spectrum. For that reason, I don't think the villain era goes far enough to protect us from a world full of actually villainous behavior. There's another character trope in movies that is far more powerful: the final girl. What is a final girl? Typically, the final girl is the last girl left standing at the end of a horror slasher movie. She faces the killer or monster or imminent threat and lives to tell the tale. Now, since her first appearance, the final girl has evolved a lot. But I'm particularly interested in one type of final girl that's become more prevalent in recent decades. It's the final girl with an arc. No final girl gets out unscathed, but this type of final girl's wounds don't define her, they give birth to the unstoppable version of her. So badass. That's sexy. That is sexy. Don't tell me a villain era is sexy. That is sexy. Anyway, I'm going to elaborate on what we can learn from the final girl trope in detail in other videos, but here is why entering your final girl era is so much more powerful than entering your villain era, if we were using the trope accurately. So, as a metaphor for life, the final girl is less about being the last one physically standing and more about the final girl that's left up here after facing her greatest fears. She brings us back to our instincts in a non-selfish way. In films, she drops society's expectations of her, cause she has to. It's about survival. She frequently learns how to shed her people-pleasing tendencies and her habit of ignoring her needs, all things in common with the villain era, but she does not push back in a way that seeks to inflict pain or suffering onto others, like a villain would. They would. That's what they are. That's what they do. That's kind of their shtick. A final girl has to learn to balance her good intentions with doing what needs to be done in order to survive. A final girl may need to learn to burn bridges along the way, but she does so with people who were never good for her in the first place. She doesn't just burn bridges and maniacally laugh and rub her hands together because she's a villain. It's about being a human. It's messy. It's complicated. A final girl learns the rules of the reality that she's in, and then she learns how to break them in order to get to the end of the movie. Sexy. Look, rule breaking can be sexy when the rules are fucking stupid. It's true. Don't do anything illegal. I'm just saying. You know, we have a lot of social rules that are stupid. A final girl tends to go from easily manipulated and naive to empowered by her own internal compass. Again, hot. She finds a way to be comfortable going against what's expected of her in order to defeat her killer without reveling in it. At least a lot. Because it's not about that. Again, the aim was never to hurt someone else. It was just to survive. And believe me, final girls, they really don't get it right all the time. They're not superheroes. She is neither hero nor villain. She's human, and adopting a mindset that focuses on that balance brings us closer to our actual authentic self, our needs, our internal compass that knows what's best for us, and all without the emotional dysfunction of being cruel to others. You don't need to go full villain to just be you, unapologetically. A villain's not authentic. They're seeking revenge due to the pain of their tragic backstory. A final girl doesn't need to be evil to fight evil. She just needs to outsmart it. She does this by adapting a heightened sense of awareness. She's able to take in new information, adapt, change her approach when she's faced with danger. Usually it's from an external threat, but oftentimes, if it's a real good movie, it's also from an internal threat. It could be an unhelpful way she sees herself or the world, and that could mean her demise if she remains unwilling to see it and unwilling to change it. The key to her success is her awareness, and her ultimate skill is adaptability. In a time where the cacophony of social media opinions rife with their own lack of self-awareness would lead you to believe that change is bad or impossible, it takes a strong mindset to have the internal compass to be able to differentiate between what the world is telling you what you need and what you actually need, and then bringing about real change. The only constant is change, and the final girl faces that one way or another. A villain doesn't change a whole lot. A villain has no flexibility, no arc, and that will always be its crux. And what's beautiful about the final girl is that for everything she's gone through, she's not a victim. The girl in Act 1 may be. Yeah, there's plenty of things happening to her that's outside of her control. But a victim mentality is never what gets her to Act 3. She gets to Act 3 because she decides she's not going to be a victim of her circumstances. Her most common arc is from learned helplessness to self-reliant. Sexy, incredible, amazing, hot. She has raw courage in the face of immense fear. She has adaptability in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. She's a survivor. Which brings me to my next point. One of the most badass things a final girl learns is acceptance. Now, Acceptance could sound like a weakness, but acceptance does not mean tolerating harm. It does not mean giving up. Acceptance does not mean defeat. The kind of acceptance a final girl learns is the most resilient approach to a life full of actually scary shit. It's tempting to mentally fight an unfair reality. We resist, we fight, we bargain, we ignore, we repress, we project, we blame. The moment you accept the situation you're in, whether internal or external, is the moment you will have the space to know how to best deal with it. And it tends to lighten the heaviness too, because a lack of acceptance for your starting point is adding more suffering on top of the initial suffering and prolonging your overall suffering. Shedding those forms of resistance as often as possible and learning acceptance is one of the hardest lessons to do, and it takes constant practice. But to find a way to do it is so freeing. It is life-changing. A villain, on the other hand, is practically the definition of resistance, the total opposite of acceptance, because it does nothing but fight its inner and outer world due to its own history of pain and unwillingness to see it and heal from it. Because of radical acceptance, many final girls end up with a very twisted sense of humor by the end of the movie. And not only is that very sexy, but it's something that I think is a highly underrated tool to deal with life. This is why the final girl era speaks to me so much. It's in favor of boundaries, it's in favor of rejecting unrealistic purity standards, it's in favor of authenticity, it's in favor of human realness, and against the need to lean into vindictive cruelty. A final girl's vulnerability, ironically, becomes her very strength. There's a lot more that I'll go into with each one of these topics, and a lot more that I've used to pull myself from the depths of PTSD following a multi-year string of so many killers that they could form their own horror universe, but I've discovered so many valuable tools by making this trope my compass, and it's changed the way that I look at life, so I wanted to pass it on to you in case it resonates with you more than your good girl complex, your villain era, or anything in between. Thinking like a final girl is like a bulletproof approach to life, because its main thing is adaptability and resilience. Despite that, it still takes a lot of courage. It takes courage to accept that we're facing a threat so that we're thrown into action. It takes courage to increase our awareness internally and externally. It takes courage to break some rules and burn some bridges, to accept that our lives will change and it may even be traumatic. But if we can continue to rise to the occasion, we will come out on the other side more resilient, knowing ourselves better, and in time being better for it. I'm not saying traumatic things are good, but I am saying that no final girl has ever come out of her situation being less prepared for the next time. Entering your final girl era holds your greatest trick, your superpower, because the trick is once you're brave enough to look your greatest fear in the face, nothing else can touch you. Sexy. With every killer in life, you may be bloodied, you may be bruised, but you'll be in the sequel ready to face the next one. With a relentlessly courageous attitude towards the complexity of life, that resilience is inevitable. Because what doesn't kill you makes you a